Welcome back to another episode on Oak and Rock Fatherhood. As always, I'm your host, Zachary Small, joined by Anthony Migliorino. Anthony, what's going on, brother?
Nothing much, Zach. What's happening?
I'm pumped, man. I'm very excited. We have a special guest on today. We
Yeah,
have
man.
Brendon Marotta. Brendon's a
Howdy.
filmmaker. He created the American Circumcision documentary, which we will be diving into. Author of multiple books, to include recently Children's Justice. He's spoken across many universities. He's been going at life, as a father, as a husband, a lot of work in the film industry. And important to our discussion today, he's an advocate and a voice for kids, putting the word out there as to how we can better recognize what we can do to better serve our children, better position them within society, and start treating them as the equals that they are. So when we talk on Oak and Rock Fatherhood, we address a lot of the subject people don't want to cover because it's too taboo, because of the emotions that are connected with it. But that's exactly why we need to talk about it. And the man who wrote American Circumcision is the exact man to have on, because he made the documentary about the thing nobody wants to talk about. So again, we're going to dive into that as well as much more. But before I start spilling all the beans, Brendon, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Very excited to dive into it. Is there anything I missed before we start the chat?
I think you about covered it. I have a new site too called Hegemon Media where I'm doing writing just about every day. So if you want some of the ideas that are in the book in short 2 to 3 minute reads straight to your email, that's another place you can go.
Excellent.
I
I'll
mean,
make sure I
if
get
you
the
have
link.
ADHD, that's where you go.
Yeah, exactly.
We get in there. So let's start at the beginning. In your book, you talk about as a youngster, a young man, you were thinking about the ways you were being treated. And you share that, you realized something wasn't quite right. And people told you, oh, you'll outgrow it or you'll get over it or something along that line. Is that where the journey began, to the films, to the books, and just to the way you're living your life?
So I think it was always there, but it took a little bit of learning and being exposed to the tools I needed to express it. So when you're an infant, the feelings are all there, right? And it's over time that you start adding on top of that the ability to express yourself through language, to think in abstractions, and to do all those sorts of things. So I had feelings, but I didn't yet have the ability to articulate why I had those feelings or what the cause of what those feelings were. And part of the reason I went into film was because as a young man, I love talking about things like religion and philosophy, but no one wants to talk about those things with a 14-year-old, which now as an older man, I sort of understand why that would be. But at the time, it bothered me because I really wanted to have deeper discussions with people about things. And I noticed that people would absorb ideas through media that they wouldn't necessarily have an everyday conversation about. And so that's initially what drew me to film, is I wanted to express myself in a way that people would actually listen and hear. And so I went to film school. I started doing editing for other people's films. And in my early 20s, I went through a period of self-development where I was basically questioning a lot of the things I've been told growing up. I was processing a lot of different emotions that I hadn't explored before. And it was during that time that I was also learning a lot about how early life events impact you later on. And in high school, I'd read some stuff about children's rights. I read the work of people like John Holt and John Taylor Gatto. And when I was in my early 20s, I also started reading people like Alice Miller and Lloyd DeMoss, who talk about how early childhood events impact you later on. And I had seen how very small things like the language that people use when they're talking to their kids impact them, how things like the school system and the way that is set up change the people's emotions and teach them emotional lessons in addition to the just sort of reading, writing, arithmetic that people think is what school's that is what school's about. And as I was learning about that, then I also learned about hospital birth and circumcision. And one of the things that first got me thinking about that as an issue was learning that for a long time, doctors believed that babies didn't feel pain, and they would do that procedure without anesthesia. And I thought, like, how traumatic would that be to do to someone with no pain relief? And I saw images of children like screaming during this procedure. And I thought, okay, well, just like the language that you use can change someone's emotional and relationship patterns as an adult, what must this do? And that's what led to the film, because I had talents as a filmmaker. That's what I was doing professionally. And so I spent 6 years interviewing basically every expert on the subject and collecting people's personal stories and filming at events, and turned that into a documentary called American Circumcision that was on Netflix. And after that, then I started thinking about social justice issues, because I noticed that the children's rights issues that I was a part of, they were doing okay, but they weren't getting the same mainstream attention that social justice issues were. And I thought, okay, well, how are they approaching things differently than children's issues are? And that led to me then researching everything I could about social justice theory and thinking about that. And then going, okay, well, if social justice is about protecting groups of people who are marginalized or victimized in some way, like there's no group that's more powerless than children, and historically oppressed too. The further back you go, the worse it gets for children in history, right? Mm-hmm. So if we were to take, if it is about, protecting oppressed people, then of course you'd apply it to children. And then what does that mean for children? So that's what the book Children's Justice is about. And we could talk about either of those, but that's sort of been the journey that I've been on over the past, I guess, 10 years now.
Well, I know when I saw that movie, it completely changed the way I looked at the world. And there's not a lot of movies that probably have done that in my life. I can probably name a few. But when you were just saying the things you said, Brendon, it made me think that if there ever comes a time where children do get equal rights, where we treat them like human beings, right? Not second-class citizens, then maybe all the other things that plague humanity will go away, right? Maybe there won't be the inequalities everywhere else, because if it starts at the beginning, right, it'll be cured to a degree.
That is something that a lot of people who work on children's issues believe, and it's one of the big ideas in my book, Children's Justice. Because if people's way of relating to others and their emotions and a lot of their personality is formed based on the events in childhood, well, if you remove trauma from childhood, they're going to relate to people differently. And so part of the thesis I have in the book is that if we treat children differently, all the other issues in society become easier, because now the people working on those issues are able to relate from a place of love and a happy childhood rather than from acting out trauma and negative childhood patterns. So and also the other social systems that cause people harm often have people in them who are acting out negative social patterns from childhood. So if someone has a way of relating to others that is based in the way that they were treated as a child, and the way they were treated as a child was good, even if they have power over someone else, even if they're in a bad system, they're going to still treat people differently. And even if you create a perfect system, but you fill it with people who are narcissists and sociopaths because of their unique childhood trauma, no matter how perfect the system you create, those people are still going to continue to cause problems. So part of the thesis of my work is that if we change childhood, everything else in society changes.
I can see that from many different angles. Peaceful parenting is an obvious and very clear one. Just stop hitting the kids. But I'm curious, when it comes to circumcision, is there any research or is there anything that says these circumcised kids lead to this path, uncircumcised kids lead to that path? Because I feel like it's the parenting more so than that event. And this is something, and admittedly, I just started thinking about this when we started going through, I came across the documentary, and Anthony was like, you got to watch it. So I've not seen it yet, but I will be watching it. And it, to me, for something to happen while traumatic, and I admitted prior to hit recording, I've changed my position on this. Originally, I was uneducated. I thought it was specifically and only either a religious choice or hygiene. I thought kids had a lot of infections if they didn't get it. And so I was like, well, it's a clear decision. I was going to say clear cut, but I didn't think that would be a little crass. A clear cut decision that's something you'd want to do. And now that I've learned a little bit more, I understand that's not the case. But to have a child minutes into the world go through that pain, yes, that's a bad thing. And I would, if I could go back, similar to your recent blog post on regretful parents, I would have changed my opinion. But I can't. I'm here. So I wonder, you circumcised your kid, but if you raise them right, they're going to be okay. So what role does the circumcision really play into that?
So it plays the same role that any trauma does. In other words, if you have someone go through a traumatic event and then they go from that event to a place where they're happy or safe or taken care of, they're going to be better off than someone who goes from a traumatic event to more traumatic events. But that doesn't erase the initial trauma. It just means that they're maybe going to be able to process it a little better. And you asked about the research of like, well, what is the impact of it? There's one study we talk about in the film where when they were giving children vaccines, inoculations, they found that one group of children responded really dramatically to the pain, and that they were crying more intensely than the others. They were having a really strong reaction to it. And so they're trying to figure out why that was. And what they found was that it was the children who had been circumcised who were responding more dramatically to the pain. And the researchers attributed this to PTSD, post-traumatic stress. In other words, they had a really traumatic event around circumcision, and then they had another pain, which was the needle going in for a vaccine. And that new pain triggered the earlier pain. So they had a PTSD response, the same way that, if someone who goes through war, if they hear like loud fireworks, they might be reminded of that experience. And so the impact is going to vary person to person on any trauma. Mm-hmm. And if you go from a traumatic experience to a home where you're not triggered much, where there's not a lot of pain, where the people do listen to and respond to you, then that trauma might not be triggered, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is or it isn't there. And of course, obviously, if you go into a really loving home, then also that could be healing in some ways if you've had previous trauma. So it's going to vary person to person really dramatically. And it's difficult to study. First of all, any psychological study is difficult to do because, people are different. They respond differently to things. And it's not like you can split test a population and then give them exactly the same childhoods, exactly the same experiences.
That's what I was hoping for.
Yeah, like
that's the answer I was hoping you could offer, because I was like, man, there's so many variables that go into that. But no, I completely understand. And like I said, I've changed my opinion on the subject. But that is an interesting thing about the vaccinations and them going back to the pain they felt. But then that leads to the question, eventually a child's going to experience pain. So the timing of it, is that even relevant? Whether they're circumcised minutes in the world or they wait 1 year and they get all those shots, it's still going to negatively impact them.
Well, what makes something trauma is that it's unresolved. In other words, if you go through a painful experience and then it's emotionally resolved in some way, then it's not trauma. It's just you went through a painful experience. It's when something happens and it's not resolved, which is very difficult to do with someone who's a newborn infant. Whereas you and I, like we're adults, if we have something painful happen, we can resolve it. One, we can resolve it by taking action in our lives in some way. But two, we can also resolve it because we have the capacity to understand our own emotions and create a narrative around them, and then change our own beliefs through that narrative or through the things that we tell ourselves. Whereas an infant doesn't have that. They just have the raw experience.
Well, they're powerless also.
Yeah. And so they're going to react to that in a way that can't necessarily be predicted. So I think that would be the distinction in terms of whether or not something causes trauma or causes a lasting impact, is whether or not it's resolved in some way. And obviously there is lots of healing work that you can do around any trauma in your life. There's whole entire sort of healing methods that people do on, for example, birth trauma or trauma around their relationship to your parents or things like that. It's just that it's a lot easier to not cause trauma in the first place, to just treat the children in a way that's peaceful, than to try to resolve it later. But it can be resolved. I mean, the challenge of this issue too is that there is a physical change to the body. And so you do have the other things that come with that physical change, which aren't psychological. So there's a change in terms of the amount of nerve endings and sensation. The nerve endings on intact men, for example, are more sensitive to pain because they're scar tissue, whereas men who are intact have greater nerve endings, and the most nerve endings are in the foreskin.
For pleasure.
So there's a huge difference there.
And so I thought you were going to go, Anthony.
No, I was going to say that because we were talking about that prior.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I thought it was the opposite.
Which is weird if you think about being circumcised. So you're saying, Brendon, that there's more response to pain in circumcised and more pleasure if not circumcised.
Yeah, so the intact body, yes, because think about scar tissue anywhere in your body that's more sensitive to pain. Mm-hmm. Whereas something that doesn't have scar tissue just has the nerve endings there.
So how would that show up in a maturity level with like in a sexual maturity level? Is there any conclusion to that with a pain pleasure response in adult men?
Are you asking if there's a study just on that particular sensation thing and what the difference is?
Yeah, so technically if you're circumcised, you would have more of a painful sensation because you're circumcised. So does that relate to sex at all? Being the actual having sex, as opposed to if you would have more pleasure if you're uncircumcised because you have those nerve receptors still intact. And now if you took them away, now you have an element of pain. Does that lead to any problems with intimacy or anything like that? Or is that anything you know of?
So again, it's going to vary person to person. I know circumcised women who say that they've overcome their trauma there and that they've resolved it in some way and that that part of their life is great. And so I don't know that, again, it's hard to measure there because people's sex lives and emotions around that and feelings around that are going to vary person to person.
Yeah. And it's not just about the organ.
Yeah, exactly. But you can measure things like nerve endings and sensations. And one of the things I write about in the new book is that part of the challenge of talking about all this is that the way that people are supposed to talk about things like this is very scientific. Do you have a study for that? What evidence do you have? And the way that people actually experience their psychology and sex lives is anything but academic. It's the way that you actually feel about it, the way that people actually make their decisions has nothing to do with any of that. Like, I doubt that most parents, before they have kids, are reading academic studies on the nerve endings of the foreskin. Like, that's just not a thing that new parents are doing. And so the way that people are making these decisions is that they're making them based on culture. They're making them based on what the dominant culture tells them. And that's the thing that I'm kind of looking at in the new book is like, well, what are we telling people about how they treat children? Because on an intuitive level, I think most people can see that, taking a knife to a child's genitals causes trauma, and having less of your sex organ means less of the pleasure that comes from that. Like, just intuitively, most people, I think, can understand that. And I can show you studies. I can show you the Sorrell study, which does like very specific sensation measurements on both the intact and circumcised body. And I could show you the Anand and Hickey pain studies and the Taddeo pain studies. But that's not how most people are actually making their decisions. And if we're being honest, it's actually these cultural things that tend to influence people more. And then, of course, the cognitive dissonance and psychological things that come up of, okay, well, if I admit that, if I see that, again, anything in our childhood might have influenced us, things, people will say that they're fine. Oh, I was circumcised and I'm fine. Or I was hit as a kid and I turned out fine. Because to acknowledge that it might not have been fine would bring up all of the feelings that come with not being fine. And those feelings might be uncomfortable to feel. And so initially, they're actually, this is another thing I write about in the book, they're actually more uncomfortable to avoid feeling. Because if one of the things that people do when they're in false consciousness, which is, again, like a social justice term that we talk about in the book, is that to avoid the pain, like to avoid seeing something or feeling a feeling, you actually have to sort of pay this constant psychological tax of pushing that feeling away and pushing it away and pushing it away. And that drains your energy. Whereas if you actually just felt it and acknowledged it, then it would be over. And it's not like the fear that I think people have around feeling their feelings or acknowledging things in their childhood is that, oh, I'm just going to, focus on that forever. But actually you focus on it, you give it your full attention, and then it clears and it heals and it resolves. So that is the distinction between trauma and something that is no longer trauma, that's healed, is that it's been resolved. And what initially got me interested in children's issues is that I had a lot of stuff that I was unresolved around that I wanted to resolve. And now that I've done that, that energy is free, and I can put it towards resolving things for others and making sure that they never have to solve this problem in the first place. So that's like, we can go into all the individual studies, and my film goes through all of that. And we literally put certain studies on screen, and we show, diagrams of exactly like, this is what the science is. And I reference a lot of that science in my book, but I also want to acknowledge the feelings there and the cultural stuff, because I think that is often what actually drives the conversation.
No, that's excellent. And I think it's absolutely necessary for people to understand that human beings are not binary. While our brain is a quote unquote supercomputer, we are much more than black, white. There is so much going on there that if you remove the emotional side of the house and the individual, you're going to miss the entire picture. And funny enough, I was the one who said, like, are there any studies on this for my personal interest? But the fact of the matter is, I've shown other parents studies saying, hey, here's what happens when you hit your kids, and they disregard it. So the study, even if you show it, doesn't matter, because in the world we're living in, you have to speak to the emotion. And obviously marketing for many years now understood this. If you can make someone feel something, they'll buy your thing. They'll become a loyal customer. They'll identify with whatever it is you're putting out there. But why are we not doing the same with our kids? Why are we not looking to see, like, how are they feeling about this? Or the adults? You've done some work. I want to make sure I got the label right. But you studied with some hypnosis and the neuro-linguistic programming. And I was wondering how that has played into your ability to go past the cut and dry black and white, and to really get someone, for you to get to know that real person behind the wall they put up. And then what approaches you take to help them to start to be more receptive to, hey, maybe the way you were raised wasn't right. Maybe the things you've done were not right. And then there comes that regret. And then you follow that up with, hey, you didn't know any better. Spanking, not spanking. There's a lot of things we could do here. There are a lot of people who have that wall up. Has your study on the mind and your study with hypnosis and the neuro-linguistic programming, have those mental tools helped you find a better way to connect with people and to be a little more efficient with that process of getting them to open themselves up to you?
They've done a lot of different things. It's hard for me to answer that, because I feel like those tools have been really useful for communication. They've been really useful for me reprogramming my own mind. So there's a lot of stuff in there. I mean, actually, one of the things that's been really useful from that is understanding how people get bad programming. So when people are taking in information, one of the things that NLP teaches is that they very commonly delete and distort that information. So you are getting so much information in a moment. You might see this video, you might see each of our screens, you might have other things going on in the room, you might have sensations in your body. All of these things are happening at once, but that's a lot of information to take in. So what people do is that they delete and distort and generalize that information. So when you tell someone later that you listened to this, you're going to say, I listened to a podcast, or I watched a YouTube video, or whatever platform you saw it on. And that entire 1 hour experience, or longer, depending on how long we talk, is going to be condensed into a few words. So you've deleted a lot of information and you've generalized. And they're going to ask, well, what did they say during the podcast? And you say, well, they talked about this. But of course, it's an hour-long podcast, so we talked about a lot of things, so we had to shorten it a lot. And so what the thing I've learned is that very often when people take in information, the thing that they come away with is often very simple, and Not true. So the full truth of what this podcast is would require you to actually listen to it for yourself and pay attention to it all the way through. Notice everything that's happening on each person's screen, or listen to every bit of audio, and make sure that the entire time that's your sole focus. And of course, most people are going to, they'll remember certain things, and they'll remember certain things, right? They might not remember every single thing that's said. And that part of the challenge around this issue is that people have so little information around what circumcision is that all they have is often generalizations and distortions. So like, it's cleaner is, for example, one of the cultural myths that exists around this. Well, what do you mean?
That's all I knew.
Like, how are you defining cleaner? Is the natural male body dirty? Is there something dirty or wrong about male sexuality? Is your child's body dirty? What do you mean cleaner? Is cleanliness a goal for our children's sexualities and bodies? Like, what do you actually mean by that statement? The moment you start picking apart that statement, it falls apart. Like, what does that even mean, right? Is there less bacteria? Are we defining bacteria as good or bad? Is it like the bacteria in your gut that's actually good for you? Like, do you actually mean by that? And is this the only way that you can accomplish cleanliness? If that's actually your primary value as a parent, which I highly doubt that it is. Like, have you ever heard of parents? I want my kids to be clean. And you're like, what is this?
Shouldn't we just rip off their fingernails then, so the dirt
right?
Doesn't get
so like,
there?
What do you mean by that? And so, what happens with cultural programming is that stuff like that goes in. And one of the signs that you're dealing with cultural programming is that people don't remember where they first heard it. So like, where did you first hear that it was cleaner?
Asking me?
Like, yeah, sure. I mean, do you remember? Is there a specific time? Is there
Absolutely not. Nope.
Yeah. It's one of those cultural myths that just kind of goes in at some point. And when you're young, kids have no, psychic defenses of any kind. Like, people just tell them stuff and it goes in, and like years later, you might be thinking about this and have this idea come back to your head as an adult and go, like, wait a minute, that makes no sense. Why did my teachers tell me that growing up, right? So this is true of most cultural myths and most of what people believe around the issue. Whereas if you get really specific and detailed, if you were to take away the euphemistic language and say, would you like someone to hold down your child and cut part of his genitals off? They're going to use this specific device, which is a clamp, which is going to apply thousands of pounds of pressure, and the foreskins actually fuse to the head of the glands, and they're going to break. Like, you'd be like, of course I wouldn't want that. Whereas if they give you the euphemism, the generalization, do you want your child circumcised? Now all of that detail has been deleted, right? So part of what I've learned from that process and what I do in the film and the book is I really deprogram people. I take all of that distortion and generalization away and go, okay, what actually are you talking about? What actually are your values here? What do you want to teach your kids as a parent? Personally, I want to teach them that I love them just the way that they are, that they don't need to, change things about their body or sexuality to be loved by people. They can be loved just the way that they are, and that their natural self and way of being is okay. So that is sort of what that's what I'm digging into in the book also is, okay, what actually are the values here? And like, where in the culture is this coming from? And can we change that? So anyway, I almost got into a whole different topic there, but
no, that was good.
I think I've answered the hypnosis question.
So the movie is centered and focused around American culture.
Yeah.
And I think the book, Children's Justice, that's more of like a global mistreatment of children.
Yes and no. So what I do in the book is I take the issue of circumcision as an example and then draw from that larger principles about how we think about children. Because I did the documentary, that's the issue that I have the most knowledge about and specific focus. And it's also the issue. It's also one of the most egregious violations of children and their personhood and their rights, right? Whereas something subtle, it might not be as obvious, taking a knife to someone's body is pretty obvious. But what I do from that is I draw out the principles of how we think about children. And I think those are cross-cultural, even if the specific example I'm using is in a particular culture. So one of the things I talk about in there is the concept of internalized dominance, which is a term from critical social justice, where they say that, dominant groups see themselves as more deserving, more worthy than groups that they oppress or that they are in power over, and that somehow they're just naturally better in some way, and that's why they're on top. It's not some sort of oppressive social structure. And so I go, okay, well, that does kind of sound like the way that people think about children. It's like, we're just more deserving, we're more important, we're more capable. And of course, then the response most people have is like, well, aren't we? I mean, adults are stronger and like, aren't we better? And there's a whole area in social justice known as disability justice, which says, okay, well, even if someone has a disability, even if they're somehow less capable according to society standards, they still deserve to be treated well. They still deserve to have their dignity respected. And the attitude towards disabled people that social justice has is, well, you should try to take care of them. You should, you should try to give them access to other things in society. Like you would build a ramp for people who need a wheelchair. And, and if someone said, oh, I can do whatever I want to this person because they're disabled, you would think that they were a monster. But yet that's how people treat children who have a similar level of functioning. Like they're just not as strong. They may not be as mentally capable. But again, also the thing that people talk about in disability justice is that from another perspective, some people who have disabilities could just be more capable, but they're being held to a social standard that's different than what their natural abilities are. So from another perspective, children are more capable than us. They learn faster, they're high energy, they can make connections in their mind quicker. Their mind is actually still developing, so they can make new connections in ways that we can't. So from another perspective, they're actually more capable than us. They're going to live longer. They have a longer lifespan, literally, than adults do. So from another perspective, adults aren't necessarily more worthy. And the perspective that you would have if they were just like any other particular group in society is, well, we need to treat them well. And we need to make sure that their unique needs are taken care of on their terms, as opposed to the way that a lot of society treats children, which is seeing them as something to fulfill adult needs, which again, on any other social class, if there's one group of people that said, this group of people over here just exist to fulfill our needs and we can do whatever we want to them, they won't remember it. And if they do remember it, it doesn't matter because their feelings aren't as important as ours. So you'd be like, that's awful. And you shouldn't do that. But people do it around their children. So,
it makes me wonder how much of this is due to empathy being beaten out of kids as they come up, and they're less empathetic adults they cannot connect to the child. When you were telling your story, I heard a lot of myself in you. I came from a rough start. I had to overcome a lot of obstacles to get to where I am now. And that, I believe, is one of my strengths because I can relate very easily to both sides of the house. I own me 100%. I understand what it means to own yourself as a man, but I also know how to relate and bring peace and connection and love because I knew what I didn't have or what I needed as a kid that wasn't there. And not that I wasn't loved, but I went through many experiences. Even now, that defense mechanism. I'm not saying my dad didn't love me because I do love my dad. We do have love, but that goes to show how it's ingrained that as a lot of adults that I see now, when you ask them, actually, I'm curious in your take. Do you see that it's a lack of empathy due to the rearing, or do you think it's fear? Because a lot of individuals do not have much power in their lives, and the only way they can exert it is when they walk in that door on their spouse or their children.
I think it's a confluence of multiple things. If it was just one thing, we'd solve the one thing and we'd be done, and that would be it. We'd all move on. So I think it's multiple things. It's the trauma that they had growing up and the resulting fragmentation. And then that trauma and fragmentation, when they grow up, they use that to create society and social systems. which are based from their trauma and fragmentation they had as children. Then the next generation is socialized into all of those cultural systems, which were created by traumatized people, and they're raised by traumatized people. So they have their own trauma, and then they have this cultural programming on top of it. Then they get to reinforce those systems when they're adults. And so now the system evolves and grows even more, and they have new trauma. And it's a cycle, right? It continually goes on. And one of the things I talk about in the book is the history of childhood. So in Europe, it was really common for people to use a wet nurse to raise their children. So after the child is born, the child goes on a cart and goes out to some woman in the countryside or some poor woman who breastfeeds the child and basically raises him or her, for the mother. And these wet nurses would be taking care of maybe dozens of children at the same time. And then after the child gets older, if he's privileged, if he's a really privileged kid, he gets to go to boarding school where he is in a strict environment with a whole bunch of other kids who have abandonment trauma because they were all raised the same way. And he is educated and basically turned into someone who can be really rational and cold and follow rules and is not connected to his emotions. And very often these kids would not have quality time with their parents until they were older, until they were like between 5 and 8. So it's only recently that system stopped. So in the late 1700s, 1800s, that system began to change. And the infant mortality rate was really high in earlier times, in part because of this system. Because one woman breastfeeding a bunch of kids who's basically a paid employee is not going to treat them the same way that a mother who loves them does. Mm-hmm. So it's only for, at least for Europe, for people who came out of that culture, it's only in the last 300 years that those people have started actually raising their own kids. So of course they don't know what they're doing. They've only been doing it a short amount of time. And the word parenting didn't really pick up until the 1960s as a term. And initially it was a term of, here's how you turn your children into what you want. You can parent them and you can create a kid who's really successful. So it's totally adult-centric. Yeah, it's a totally adult-centric, you could almost replace it with the word manipulation. Here's how you manipulate your kids and mold them. Or molding children would be another word. And it's only, again, in the last couple decades that the term has become, what if we actually considered the child's needs in doing this? So the fact that people don't know how to do this, I have a lot of empathy for that, because it's actually only a fairly recent idea in Western culture that we could, consider the child's needs and put that first.
Yeah. What I find amazing is when I talk to other parents, and especially fathers, I try to point that out, right? This is something new. Peaceful parenting, being a better father, working hard to show your kid a good example and be a positive influence in their life. It hasn't been done before. Throughout history, kids have been brutalized, tormented, they've been hit, they've been spanked. And the number one thing I hear all the time is, well, because we've been doing this for maybe a decade, they say, well, look how the kids are turning out these days, right? Look how spoiled they are and entitled. And it's almost like we can bypass all of history, all the torture and pain that was dealt with. And just because in the last 10 years, we started saying, hey, let's treat our kids like real people. Now, all of a sudden, everything's a mess because of those 10 years. And we know that it doesn't happen that quick, right? Trauma doesn't get healed that fast. The generational trauma that's passed down, that's deep rooted. It's heavy. It's hard for most people to get out of. And what Zac was saying before about how he can see both sides, how he grew and became a better man. 99% of the people don't go that route. Right? The 1% or very few, the outliers, may go on to be successful. The large majority go on to live lives of addiction, pain, suffering, domestic abuse, a lot of really bad things, poverty. And, we see these statistics pop up just from a father not being present. So throw in all the abuse for generations. And it's amazing how they don't see this distinction. They just always say, oh, well, you stop spanking your kids. That's why they're rioting in the streets.
I'd argue too that the same system is continuing today and it's just more hidden. So we might not have wet nurses in boarding schools, but we have hospital birth, daycares, and public schools.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing. It's just hidden better. And this is one of the things that some of the philosophers I reference in my book talk about, is that the nature of power is that it becomes more hidden over time, because really overt power is open to more threats. Like if in ancient societies, power was basically, I'm the king, do what I say or people will kill you.
Yeah.
Whereas now we have, oh no, we the people are in charge. We have democracy.
Yeah. Go pick your job. You can be whoever you want to be.
Yeah, you can be whatever you want to be, but you do have to have a job and you do have to be a part of the system.
And you do have to pay us.
Yeah, exactly. So what happens over time is that the power becomes more hidden. And I think the same is true of trauma. If you think of trauma as almost a separate organism, like a virus, and it has the same evolutionary pressures as a virus. You know, humans don't want to get sick, they don't want to get viruses, and they also don't want to have trauma. So humans do everything we can to avoid trauma and stomp that out. So the evolutionary pressure we put on trauma is going to make it so that only traumas which are better hidden and better at reproducing themselves survive. And so something that is not even seen as a trauma is probably going to be one that has less, has a greater likelihood of surviving, because if humans don't see this thing, then they're not going to be trying to stamp it out. So it evades its predator, if you will. And the other thing that would happen is that, it's going to go to places where it can reproduce easily and have the longest lifespan. And if it gets into children, well, children have the longest lifespan and the least defenses against trauma. And if it really wanted to reproduce, if we think of it as an organism that wants to spread itself, well, it would essentially do what gamers do, which is it would spawn camp. It would wait for where the humans come out and get them immediately when they come out, when they have the least defenses. And it would you could even think of it as like trying to farm humans. Like, well, if we create a space where humans come in and then trauma can infest them, that would be the best for it as an organism, for its reproduction. And so I look at hospital birth and I think, like, that's the trauma farm. That's the place where people, there's all these unnecessary procedures. There's the least psychological defenses. And that I think is what, if you think of trauma as like a virus or an organism, that is what it's going to be trying to do. And so when people say, well, it doesn't look like a trauma, like, it's a bit like saying, well, it doesn't look like it's camouflaged. Well, of course it would be. It's because if you saw it immediately as trauma, you wouldn't do it. And then this particular sort of mimetic virus or psychological virus wouldn't reproduce itself.
That's crazy.
Brendon, I've been podcasting for about 6-7 years. Not once have I said the phrase mind blown. You just tripped me out, man. I was with you on that journey all the way back. And I'm like, we have accepted a system. Like there's so much acceptance of very dark things. And I get very frustrated with a lot of it. But I never went down that path we just went on, to where it should be normal. The home births, the local, the peaceful, without the wires, the beeping, the fluids. My wife and son almost died in childbirth at a hospital. And so my brain is also operating over here thinking about the trauma she went through. I'm going to be talking about that tonight. But it's incredible when you think about it in that light, how clear it is. And yet, when you point out that's, like I said, that was good. When you talk about spanking, when you talk about hitting, that's much more surface level. That's not as deep of a journey there. But when you bring that up, there's a lot of resistance. And if you can't get someone to break through just that, how can you get them to ever go down to the hospital, to the virus, discussion we just had? Here on Oak and Rock, we chose those titles intentionally. Oak. It's a strong tree that's not going to get blown away in the wind, but you got to build it up. It's got to face the storms, but then you have deep roots, deep connection to your family. Rock. You're hard. You're immovable. Things aren't going to sway you from what you stand for. You'll stand there, you'll protect it. And that's what we view men to be. Fathers should have strong connections to their family. They should be hard men. They should be, taking care of themselves so they can be loving with their family and protect them as well. We talk about a lot of steps men can take to become that. What do you think is the step to going against the system that you just listed that is a breeding ground for that trauma?
healing and integrating your own consciousness.
You've been asked that question before.
No, it's just I feel that strongly about it.
Yep.
I know that in my own parenting that anytime I feel like doing anything other than treating my son well, it has to do with me and my trigger and something that I need to change in my own consciousness. Always.
100%.
Yeah. And that's something you never lose, right? I know you're a new dad, and I've been a father for 24 years. And those are things I'm still learning probably every month, every week. There's always something where I'm saying, what I'm about to do, what I'm about to say, how am I supposed to act? Is this reflective of who I am as a man? And to me, I've healed a lot because of my kids, right? Being able to give them what I was missing in return has healed me. So being kind to them, being empathetic, listening to them more, it allowed me to listen to myself more. And it made me find peace within myself because I can bring the volume down a little bit, right? I don't have to be stressed out. I don't have to get angry. And I can see my kids for who they are, right? Young people learning, trying to navigate life. And then I can, once that was tapped into, then I can offer myself even more to my kids. I can be a better father. I can take care of myself, and now I can take care of them. So I think what you're doing and how you're going about it, and I say this to Zac all the time, like your kids are going to be at such an advantage to the rest of the world just because you guys are able to become better men, better fathers, and that's going to radiate to them, right? And I don't think there's much that can stop that. Said I'm done.
I felt it.
The mic drop moment.
I did have one question for you, and I don't think we've ever spoken about politics, so I don't know your views. But when you talk about trauma and we talk about the abuse of power, to me, it's nothing's more clear than the government, right? Controlling its citizens, especially now what's going on in this day and age. And there's a lot of people I'm sure that we follow and we've listened to, we've read their books, a lot of very smart intellectual people. What I wanted to ask you is, how do you see this connection that they have where they support let's say the socialist or the very far left agenda with this abuse of control, but at the same time, they advocate for peaceful parenting and healing your trauma, but they don't see the trauma from that top down. What do you think about that? Or is that something?
What's the specific question about that? Because there's multiple ways I could go with that. Are you saying that you're saying there's a contradiction between that there's people who support very authoritarian government, but then want a very permissive home, and they don't see that authoritarian? Okay.
Yeah, they want a very logical, rational, peaceful parenting based home where they see the power structure there, but they miss it in society because there's a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that the reason that people I think anyone who advocates for any kind of authoritarianism does so because they see a threat out there in the world in some way and think that the only way to deal with that threat is to overwhelm it with force in some way. And so one of the things that I talk about towards the end of the book, and I also, earlier I talked about the concept of fragmentation. So when someone has trauma, there's often a split in their consciousness where the part of them that feels safe in that situation becomes their conscious personality, and the part of them that doesn't feel safe goes into the unconscious. So you'll see this, for example, with people who are sexually abused. People who are sexually abused will often have a split between their sexuality and the rest of their consciousness. And so they'll either completely shut down all sexuality because it's not safe for them to feel that, or they'll become hypersexual and have no boundaries in that area of their life. And that split occurs because there was abuse early on, and part of them was safe and part of them wasn't. And you'll see this sort of like split personality thing where sometimes one will be out and sometimes the other will be out. And often what happens when people aren't aware that there's fragmentation in their consciousness in some way is that they will project the part of themselves that they're repressing or the part in their unconscious on others. So if they're not in touch with the part of themselves that wants to have power over others, I mean, literally, I think everything that you see in the world, there's a part of your consciousness that is capable of it or is connected to that in some way. But if you're not connected to it, then you're gonna what people will do is they'll see it out in the world, they'll project it, psychological projection, and then they'll try to get rid of it, and they'll treat it the way that they treat that part of their consciousness within themselves. So if someone, for example, is really against the concept of hate, and they want to be a nice person, they want to love everyone gets along, they're against hierarchy of any kind, then anyone they see as thinking that they're better than them or engaged in hate, they're going to just completely try to shut that down. But of course, in doing so, there's an unconscious part of them that they're not aware of, that's still influencing their personality. So you ask, like, well, how is it that someone in one area of their life can be really peaceful, and I don't want, they don't want any force of any kind used, and another area of their life they're like, oh yeah, maximum force, like, let's just get rid of those people. It's because there's one part of their consciousness where they're like, no, I want to feel good, I want to feel safe. And there's another part of their consciousness that's like, I don't feel safe, I want to get rid of that thing that made me feel unsafe, I want to stamp it out, right? So if you see like this doesn't make sense, there's like a split personality there is a split personality there. There's fragmentation due to trauma. Like that's what's going on. And
somewhat of a false self.
Yeah. And that's going to be true across political philosophies. That there'll be people who are like, well, you have this position on this thing and this and that doesn't make sense. Like it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Well,
fragmentation due to trauma.
It's like, I don't want to force my kids. I want to teach them principles and values, but I want these people to control every aspect of my life, and I want to be obedient to them. It's very strange to me how you can get caught up in that mix, right? It's where are the principles that guide you? How do you?
I would have to, I think for each person that might be different, and I'd have to get really curious about what their personal reality is around that, because they may not even see it as wanting authoritarian control.
Yeah.
Very often too, this is one
might be seen as they're doing good for the common.
Yeah. So you can really hide a concept if you just use two different words for the same thing. So, when their side does it, it's hate. And when our side does it, it's moral righteousness.
Yeah.
Like same thing, like that thing is bad, we have to get rid of it.
Yep.
But now we've given it two words and now we don't have to acknowledge the similarities, right? And this is something that my book Children's Justice gets really into, is the language that people use to talk about certain things. So there's an entire field in social justice of what's known as epistemic injustice, which is basically the idea that what people accept as truth, or who has access to truth, or those sort of things, could actually be a social justice issue. And one of the concepts in there is something called hermeneutical injustice. And I know these are like strange sounding words, but there's a reason that
we talk about this all the time.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'm glad that this is a common parenting topic. But one of the things that they talk about, that concept is basically that if you don't have the word to describe an injustice, that itself could be an injustice. So the example that the woman who coined this term, hermeneutical injustice, gives is the creation of the word sexual harassment. Like, you don't think that word was actually invented, but it was for a very particular court case. And this woman had her boss, making sexual advances towards her and then trying to play it off as a joke. And people asked her, well, were you raped? And she said, no. And they said, okay, well, we don't understand what the problem is. And it wasn't rape, but it also wasn't nothing. And so she needed a word to describe that in-between space where he was making advances toward her, but she knew she could say no, but she was still uncomfortable and she couldn't really stop the advances from continuing to come. And part of the concept of hermeneutical injustice is that there might be injustices that we still experience that we don't have a word for. And that not having the word means that that the reason they're not solved is that we don't have the word. So think about like how much social change has been created just by certain words. So if I took away the ability for someone to use the word racism or gender or social construct, like how would they even be able to articulate some of the concepts that social justice activists talk about? The flip side of that is that maybe there's a word that we really need that we don't have. We just don't have the language for. And so a lot of what my book does is try to create language around some of that, around, okay, well, if you really want to look, actually, there's another thing I talk about, is if you really want to look at the injustice people experience, like children have that the most. They literally don't have language at all. There is no ability for them to talk about their experiences. And yet they have really intense experiences and they actually can communicate those experiences. So children don't have language, but they're really good at communicating their emotions through their body and through the sounds that they make. And they're constantly communicating them. But because adults, the dominant group in that situation, don't recognize that as communication, very often they experience what social justice activists would call epistemic violence or epistemic injustice, where their way of communicating is not acknowledged and seen, even though it's actually really clear. You can tell when a baby's unhappy. You can tell when he's happy too. It's very clear. Anyway, I forgot
no,
what
hearing
the
you
original
guys.
question was, but
No, it was good because as you guys were going on, it made me think of the man who's saying, resist the government, stand up against them. Why are you following, you sheep? And then his kid comes in. He's like, hey, do what I said because I said so. You are doing the thing you're saying. And, when you're speaking on words, well, I'm not abusing my kid. That's discipline.
But what if we took that word away? Exactly. He's not in touch with it. He's calling it discipline.
Right.
But when the government does to him, it's authoritarianism, right?
Yep.
Yeah, it's
two words for the same concept.
So I know on the other side of it is when you're not even trying to stand against the man. All right, be inclusive. We need to welcome everyone. We need to be open for it. Hey, be quiet, kid. No kids allowed. Wait a minute. How are you fighting for equality? But the age, is that the metric? So it can't be gender. It can't be skin. Those things, equality for all. But age, you go against age. He's below 15. You don't count. That I don't understand it. But again, I don't think they understand how they're not seeing it. That's just the world they operate in. Those two, conscious, subconscious, how we're going to look at it, there's a barrier there. The something intense, I would assume, would have to happen to break that wall down for them to actually reflect and objectively assess themselves to say, oh my goodness, I am the thing I'm saying I'm against.
Yeah. So in healing work or personal growth of any kind, you always have to deal with the barrier to change, or the part of them saying no to change first, which again, we're talking about fragmentation. That's really common for someone to say, I want to change. You're talking to one part of them that wants to change, and there's another part that doesn't. Everyone experiences this. Like, I want to be jacked and in shape, and I also like donuts and ice cream. Like, split there. We got two parts. I got to get them on the same page for that health to go the way that I want. But it's extreme. It's true of every aspect of a person's life. You talk to people, they say, I want to do this, I want to do that. Okay, well, let's talk to the part of you that maybe doesn't. And that's true of parenting too, that people want their kids to be a certain way. And then you say, okay, well, are you willing to grow and change and become a different person in order to have your kids also experience that? And it's like, I don't know. I think I turned out fine. Now you're talking to the other.
So do you think that this progression, right, this awakening of consciousness that we see in the world, or maybe it's we just see it, right? I mean, maybe the majority doesn't see it. But do you think that this is just happening because of evolution, of like we have to do this in order to survive? Or do you think it's a signal, or it's happening because there's so much pain in the world right now?
Both. So pain is a psychological, your body feels pain because it wants to tell you to pay attention to something. Like pain is, and trauma itself too, creates learning. So if you are in a difficult situation and that is resolved, then you learn from it. And I think when people say, oh, I want my kids to be tough, or everyone experience, like they want their kids to have the learnings of that experience. But you can have the learnings without the trauma. If you have something difficult and then it's resolved, then you can have the learning that comes from that. And so I think that there's a lot of pain in the world because people haven't gotten the learning yet. And that's sort of how human consciousness works, is that, something comes up and it gets a little louder, and it gets a little louder, and it gets a little louder. And then eventually it's like, yo, pay attention to this. This is important.
Yeah.
And we're at the stage where there's certain things that people have not paid attention to for thousands of years. And, it's coming up.
So with your son, as he grows up and he gets older, what is going to be your approach to what you just mentioned, right? The father who wants their kid to be tough and makes them do hard things, like things they might not want to do. Would you be, because the way I look at it is with my kids, I never forced them to do hard things. I never made them do hard stuff because I wanted them to be strong. I let them go at their own pace. And when there was trouble or challenges, I was there to help and support them. And a lot of fathers I speak to, they have this fear-based mechanism that makes them want to control everything and push their kid into harder stuff because they are afraid that they might grow up to be weak and less motivated, less resilient. Are these things that you've thought about as your boy grows?
One of the things that stuck out to me in your question was the language. So there's an idea in NLP that people are either towards motivated or away from motivated. So if you ask someone, say someone comes to you for coaching around something in their business and you ask them what they want around that, they might say, I want more money. That's towards, they're going towards money. Or they might say, I want to get out of debt. So they're trying to get away from debt. So they're towards motivated or away from motivated. And the challenge with away from motivation is that once you're away from it, the motivation ceases. So if you're trying to get away from punishment, once you're not being punished, there's no more motivation. And so you see that with a lot of kids who are raised in really strict religious households, for example, that when they go off to college, they just go crazy because their motivation to be a good, obedient kid was if they weren't a good, obedient kid, they would be punished. Whereas someone who is motivated to want to be good at something because they love it, and they really want to be the best at this particular thing, there's no limit to the amount of energy they'll put into it. So when I hear, I don't want my kids to be weak or don't want them to turn out a certain way, one, the mind is focused on what it doesn't want. So if I say, I don't want you to think about a purple elephant, where does the mind go, right? Whereas if I say, I want you to think about a soaring eagle, like your mind's more likely to go towards the target that I'm setting on the second statement than to do what I literally asked you to do on the first statement. And so I would get curious about, okay, you don't want your kids to be weak. What do you want them to be instead? And what I know for myself and for my own parenting is that I really want my son to feel safe, to feel capable, to trust himself and his own knowing. And so that's going to create different choices than if I was like, I don't want him to be weak. And when I think about, okay, if I want him to be strong, I think that if he has a really strong sense of self, and then on top of that, he learns that he can get good at things and that it's fun to get good at things, that he'll naturally get good at things. So he's still a baby. I don't have to like push him in any way for him to want to try new things. I don't have to be like, start rolling.
Start walking now.
We gotta like if you did the instruction around the things that babies naturally learn the way that we do anything else, I'm certain that we would have a walking success rate that mirrors the American literacy rate. It would. But the thing there is, I don't know that it changes later. I got really into reading. I was a kid as a kid. I was dyslexic. I'm still dyslexic. And I was told by my family was told, he's not he's a slow learning at reading. And was actually happening. So I was really bored by all the books that I was reading because they weren't very interesting to me, because I was a smart kid and reading Hop on Pop was just not interesting to me. And it wasn't until they gave me some fantasy novels and I read stuff like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And I just took off on it. And now my office is full of books and I've written 3 books. So apparently I learned
possible.
Yeah. So
make movies, write books.
Yeah,
I can't even speak English and I have a YouTube channel. So anything's possible.
A lot of support there.
Yeah.
You know, to bring it in a slightly different direction, but still in the same theme. You know, Anthony earlier had mentioned that not a lot of dads are talking about the things we're talking about. Not a lot of fathers are, but it's normal for the 3 of us to sit here and talk about this. This is a normal thing. There's nothing taboo on the table. We'll talk about parenting, circumcision, religion, politics, whatever. You have gone to Yale, the International Congress for Association for Prenatal and Perinatal Psychology, International Conference on Men's Issues, and International Symposium on Genital Autonomy and Children's Rights. All of those places are exactly aligned with the things we're talking about. So it makes sense that they'd be like, yeah, man, come on. Did you face resistance with more mainstream outlets, though? When you started going there to pitch the movie, when you start going to more public forums that aren't focused on these issues, when you start talking fatherhood, circumcision, what kind of pushback, if any, did you receive?
So one clarification, I spoke at Yale. I didn't go to Yale. Just I have a friend who went to Yale.
Okay, I want to make sure I said that.
I'm not trying to stolen valor it.
Well, to be clear, too, that was a pitch, Brendon, for Oaken Rock Fatherhood Security System. We're going to try to sell you when you go to your next event. If you need protection.
Walking around, we got your back. But I'm thinking, one of the things that we're working on is making this more normal. I want this discussion to be more normal in the home. I want fathers to find it very normal to talk to another father about parenting instead of just what's on TV and football. And so talking about any resistance you might have faced, maybe that'll help these guys find a little toolbox to put in their, or a tool to put in their head for when they're afraid the guys are going to laugh at them. The guys are going to, hey, you can't talk about being a dad.
I feel like the resistance that I would face has almost nothing to do with me and everything to do with the other person. In other words, when people don't want to talk about something, it's often because they have a pre-existing idea about what that conversation will be, or an emotional trigger coming up in reaction to the conversation. And the idea of what the conversation will be, if you're aware of that, you can avoid it in certain ways. So one of the things I did with my film and the speaking that I've done is I just present it in a certain way. And I feel like the presentation of a documentary and a film often feels very professional and safe to people. Whereas, someone just talking to them on the street is different. Regarding presentation, you've probably seen articles where they'll have like a famous concert musician play on a busy subway street, and then they'll play in Carnegie Hall for hundreds of dollars a ticket, and no one will stop when they're just a musician busking on the street. And I think that there's something similar around this, where the dominant cultural institutions that often harm children present themselves really professionally. So if you want a doctor to give you bad advice and prescribe you a bunch of medicine you don't need, he will charge you a lot for it. He has many degrees on his wall saying that he is an expert in bad advice. And, there's all sorts of things that they do to sort of dress it up in a particular way. Whereas someone who is advocating for things that actually help children is often not perceived the same way and not given the same recognition by dominant cultural institutions. So as much as possible, presenting things differently has been the thing that's helped me the most, is just presenting it in a certain way. And my own mindset is such that it seems normal to me. I don't my energy is like, I don't have any, whatever other people have around it, the triggers and cultural beliefs. Like, that's just not my worldview. That's not my perception. So even to answer that question, I kind of have to put my mind in the mindset of someone who is very different. And I have found that you can get away with a lot in life if you're just very confident and act like it's normal. And very often people will join you in that energy and they will feel like it's safe and normal too, because then they'll also have the reference experiences if they're willing to go along with you for a little bit of, okay, well, I did talk about that and it was safe and it was normal and it wasn't what I thought it would be. So maybe this is okay. As far as pushback from cultural institutions, the thing that seems to come up is other people's triggers, their particular stuff going on, and I just basically don't worry about that. It's there again. There's always a challenge when I'm doing stuff that's professional around this of like if someone says no, did they say no because they're triggered by the subject matter in some way, or was it something about how I'm presenting myself, or they just have a lot of emails and they don't get back? There's always that little question in the back of my mind. And my solution has just been more, just put more out. We're in a day and age where you can publish anything to the whole world immediately. So if one person says no, fine, just more. I can always do more. And also to choose mediums where I can produce it myself. So, if you two were waiting for I don't know, like the Dr. Phil show or something to have you come on and talk about fatherhood stuff, you'd probably still be waiting. Whereas with this, you're on, whatever episode you're on, and you can just keep doing them. Yeah. And so I just take the same approach of it's normal to me. I'm setting the frame and I'm just going to keep going from that perspective.
There was a genesis to that. We had Joshua Lysek on, big on peaceful parenting, persuasive parenting, him, Nova Boy, kind of we back-to-backed them, and they both hit the same thing: stop manipulating your kids. But one of the things Josh said was that it's easy to bring people on if you're using the honey versus the vinegar. And so instead of walking up and slapping them in the face, with unconditional parenting book and saying, don't hit your kids, share, hey, look at the connection I have. Look at the joy in my home. Look, my respectful relationships, everybody's getting along. And you show that. Well, how did you get that with your son? He's a teenager. He's this, he's that. Mine don't listen to me. Oh, well, and then that opens the door, as opposed to just yelling at them, stop hitting your kids. And so seeing that, I agree. I kind of just operate in my world. I share my results. And that's literally everything. If anybody wants the secret sauce to how I do what I do online, I live my life. I'm honest about it. I share it and people connect with it.
So there's one more thing that I'm doing with the latest book. That everything else I said before, that's based on experience and I've done it and it's been going well. And then there's one new thing I'm doing with the current book, which is going to be a little more dangerous, and we'll see how it turns out. But I am putting some huge slaps in that book, just so you know. It is coming out of the gate with some strong language, and it's going to be very polarizing. But again, that's a choice. And that's also a choice. There's a saying, because the topic of sales has come up a couple times. There's a saying that you shouldn't try to sell the unsellable. Meaning, if someone's not your audience, if they are never going to buy what you're selling, don't even try. And so that book is very much looking at dominant institutions and people who are engaged in or profiting off of harming children, and not even trying to convince them of anything, and just saying, here's what I think you're doing. And yes, this is going to be triggering for you to hear. And yes, it's going to be confrontational. And by the way, I'm going to use the language of social justice because that is some of the most confrontational language that exists in politics now, but it's also a very dominant, clear moral framework. And it will be controversial, and I'm okay with that. But again, there, I'm normalizing, I know I'm saying some things in that book that are going to be very polarizing to different groups of people, and I'm okay with that because that's my truth. And again, just presenting it confidently, professionally, even though in there I know some of this is going to be controversial, but I'm going to say it.
Do you know how to do a full drop kick if somebody's coming at you?
Maybe that's the next podcast we should. We should work on those skills.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
I apologize. The New Yorker comes out every once in a while.
It flares. So I was looking at Anthony. You're talking about sales. Anthony's wearing a shirt by Don Hickman. Great dad, motivated dude. He runs a brand called Wake Up Call, and this is Epic Dad Co. It's a guy named Drew, runs Epic Dad Co. Both good men. When it comes to, look, you're not going to buy what I'm putting out there. What about you? When it comes to parenting resources, what are your go-tos that other people could check out if they want to start ingesting content that aligns with the direction they're trying to head with their family? I mean, and that goes for anything: books, website, blogs, podcasts, whatever.
Yeah. So aside from my own stuff, because my stuff is very focused on the larger systems that affect people, I actually feel like parenting itself is often very simple, and it's all of the distortions and triggers and traumas and other things in the world that are really complex. The things that have helped me the most are the Dunstan baby language course, which basically breaks down all the different sounds that infants make. And there's a woman who's an opera singer who made it, and she noticed that when kids yawn, their mouth makes a certain shape, and that makes a certain sound. So if you hear that sound, the child's tired. Like he's telling you he's tired. And then when they nurse, their mouth makes a different shape. So when it makes that shape and makes that sound, they're telling you they're hungry. And that was so helpful for when our child was a newborn, because we did that course beforehand. We'd hear a sound, we go, oh, this is exactly what he's asking for. And it was crazy how consistently true it was.
That's awesome.
My wife is really big on an app called the Wonder Weeks, which tells you like exactly what's going on developmentally with your child when you put their birthday in. There's a book I read beforehand called the Continuum Concept, which is very influential in the way that I thought about parenting. It's by a woman who went to, I think it was a tribe in Peru, and saw how they were parenting. And she said, these are the most confident, strong people I've ever met. And they did basically what we would now call really strong attachment parenting. So their kids were being held and on them basically all the time. And then the kids would choose when they wanted to move and run around and move away from their parents. And they would do very dangerous things when they were older, but they would do them safely and the parents would let them do them. So there was this incredible safety when they're very small, and then this support and letting them do what they wanted when they were older. And then of course I love the writing of Alice Miller, but she's more focused on she's a child psychologist and focuses on healing the impact of early life stuff. And the process that I use for resolving trauma that's helped me the most is something called the completion process. So you can learn that from the book by Teal Swan, The Completion Process, which is great. I mean, like, this is just a list of things that help me personally. But I feel like they're all pretty great. So those are the things that have helped me the most.
No, that's fantastic. And that's exactly what we want. There's no cookie cut mold to this. And what worked for you might not work for them. But what you say might be exactly what they need to hear.
I mean, the underlying philosophy for all the stuff that I like is to understand your child's reality and their needs and try to meet those needs in the way that they need. And I feel like parenting is in some ways like any other relationship, except that the person who you're taking care of has a very different reality than you. So like as an adult, when I leave the room, other adults know that I'm still there, I still exist, and that I can come back. Whereas if you leave the room around your child when they're very young, they don't have object permanence yet. They don't know that you're coming back. They don't have enough reference experiences for that yet. And so they don't know if when you leave, if you've left forever and they're abandoned and all the bad things that could happen to them are about to, or if you're coming back or not. And so it's just a lot of understanding the child's reality and then giving them what they need around that. So, that's different at every age, and it's different. It's also varies a bit from kid to kid, but it's basically the same of like, okay, well, if I was in a relationship with someone, I would and I depended on them for my survival, I'd want to make sure that I was safe. Like, it's that simple in some way.
It is that simple. Unfortunately, too many parents don't see that. They don't acknowledge it. And they're actually harming their kids in more ways than you could ever imagine. So I think it's great to share resources. I mean, I share so many books that I've read about parenting with fathers all the time. And to be honest, there's a lot of dads who come back to me and say, "Hey, man, I've never thought of something like that before. Thank you." Right? I stopped hitting my kid. And then as fathers, like, I stopped hitting my kid. Now what? And I'm like, well, now you got to learn better ways, brother. Right? You got to figure things out. We keep progressing. We keep getting better. So these conversations are important. Fathers need to hear this. Mothers need to hear it. We try to get moms on too. This isn't just a fatherhood show. We want the other side's perspective. We want moms and dads to work together and build strong families. That's the intention.
I will say one of the things that I talk about in the latest book and that I've been writing about online is I think that the current model of parenting that exists, or the way that people think about it, is really individualistic. That, like, you as an individual parent are a lone individual, and all the decisions were your independent decisions that you obviously made entirely rationally and after evaluating everything, and that you are the only one who's responsible for them, and that everything about how your child turns out or what happens to them is your individual blame or responsibility. And on the one hand, I think there's an incredible power in taking full ownership and responsibility for the people in your life. And on the other, I think that doing that requires you to acknowledge that there are a lot of things beyond your control, and that you are not the only factor in the universe. In other words, you had all this stuff acting on you growing up, and you had all these cultural systems you were brought into, and there were certain things that happened to you growing up that affected your psychology. And there's all of these different systems in the world that you're existing in. Most people who for example, have to send their kids to daycare, I don't think would choose to do that, but there's some sort of economic thing going on for them where they feel like they have to, or like that there's a cultural expectation that you're supposed to have they don't know that it might be safer to have your kid outside the hospital. And so I think that part of the reason parents often become really defensive around receiving new information on parenting is because they have this idea that parenting is somehow a reflection of them and them alone, and all of it's a reflection of them as a person rather than a reflection of all of the factors that went into them becoming the person they are, and that there might be these other cultural systems acting on them that are bigger than them, that have nothing to do with them. And so what happens, I think, in that individual model is that all the blame gets put on the parent, and in doing that, all of these other systems acting on them are able to avoid responsibility. So, for example, on the issue of circumcision, well, you chose to have your child circumcised, but did you? I mean, did you train medical students to do it and then manufacture devices to do it and then create a sales funnel that was planted in the place where children are born, and then create cultural norms around it, and then use high pressure sales tactics on someone who's just gone through the experience of having a child? Did you really do all of that? Or was there this whole system set up where at the end, one person signed a document and now they get all the blame because they're the ones whose signatures on the document? They didn't even do it themselves. That someone else was paid to do it, right? I look at that and I go, okay, well, there is responsibility for the one part you played in that system. Yes. And you want to do everything you can to make sure your kids are safe. But also, I think there's some that the medical system and this system that acted on parents also has some responsibility in this situation. And that is probably true across different social systems. So, okay, if you're a parent, even the cultural concept of that you need to discipline your children and what that means, I don't think you invented that concept. I think that concept came to you through culture. And it came at a time when people weren't necessarily evaluating it the same way. And so when you start to see all those other systems, then some of the defensiveness can go away. And you can drop that because it's not you as an individual who's responsible for everything that's being, talked about. It's all these other cultural systems that you happen to be a part of. And once you take ownership for your role in it, you can start to withdraw from the systems. You can start to participate in different ones. You can act differently. You can do things that are going to be better for your children. But I think some of the defensiveness comes from people, when they receive that information, they're in some way feeling like that they're being blamed for things that weren't their choice and that they actually didn't create in the first place. When in reality, what's happening is they're being made aware of things that are not, that had nothing to do with them, that were there long before they were even born in most cases, that they're just being made aware of them so they can make a different choice.
Yeah.
I think of it like 10,000 pounds being on somebody, and you're only responsible for 100 pounds of that. And when you start to share the weight, you can start to put it on those other institutions and be like, no, this is you did this. And instead of feeling bad and just like self-defeating, I really appreciate you sharing that angle, because that's something I'm going to take and use. Because a lot of fathers come in and they'll talk to Anthony and I, and they're really beating themselves up. Because like, I didn't know there was another way. This is how I was brought up. It's all I knew. Nobody else ever showed me otherwise. And to take that approach and be like, all right, you have to give yourself some breathing room here. I understand, like you said, the power of taking it all on. I get it. You're a man. You want to be responsible, but it's okay to take the responsibility for what you are responsible for. You are not responsible for the 10,000 pounds. Pick up your 100 pounds and let's work through that. But let other things fall on other people or institutions or whatever.
I mean, to use that analogy, it's even more than that. It's that the institution is putting thousands of pounds on you and then telling you that you're only lifting 100 pounds because you don't see the stuff they're putting on your back.
Damn. Why can't I lift this 5 pound weight? It's only 5 pounds.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no.
I don't understand. Like, I feel like I should be able to be a good parent in this system where both parents have to work 8 hours a day, and then they barely make enough money, and they also had lots of trauma growing up, and there's not as much community or extended family around to give them the support they need. So when they get home, they are with their kids, they're really stressed. And like all of the food that we're eating is not healthy and full of weird processed stuff. And like, I don't understand why I'm not able to do this. Like,
but
why is this hard?
Isn't the system set up for your own good? Isn't that the key to it?
I mean, it certainly presents itself that way, but
it depends if you're asking the system or not.
Right.
Oh man.
So Brendon, this has been a fantastic discussion. I have links to your documentary, your website, and then your work, the books. Is there anything for people that are listening, they're picking up what you're putting down, they want to connect further? What's the best way for them to connect with you? And is there anything else coming down the pipeline you could share for them to stay tuned for?
I am at BD Marotta on all social media. So my first two initials and my last name. And www.hegemonmedia.com is where I am publishing short articles nearly every day. I think that's the main focus for now, is to just put stuff out there. There might be an audiobook version of Children's Justice in the future. I have to do a little more research on how to do that. And I think that book's the main thing now. But you can also find the documentary at circumcisionmovie.com and all the places people buy movies. And yeah, those are the main places. I think we covered it.
No, that's excellent. I want to thank you for your time, coming on this discussion. Like I said, I've not once in 7 years, hundreds upon hundreds of podcasts, really had myself tripping out on live, on camera, but it was just great. And like I said, there's a lot for me to dive into. I've got the book ready to go. I've got the documentary I'll be watching probably tonight. It's a lot of great discussions. It's great to see other people talking about the things that some people try to avoid. And so being able to have some time with you to sit down and break it down one-on-one, that was fantastic. So I thank you again for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been fun.
Yeah, good to see you again, Brendon.
You too.
All right, for everybody who tuned in, This has been another episode on Oak and Rock Fatherhood. As always, don't just listen to what we spoke about. Brendon said it earlier. Really soak it in, learn something, and then go apply it. Nothing changes if there's no action taken. So listen, I hope you enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, do all those great things. But more importantly than anything, if you want changes to occur in your life, apply the information you're learning here. Observe what happens, the consequences of those choices, and then modify to get to where you want to go, which is a more peaceful and connected home. Until next time, I'm Zac. That's Anthony. Stay well.